Hey everyone, and welcome back. I'm really excited for this deep dive today, especially because it was actually inspired by, your research on open access journals in special education. We had no idea it would lead us down such a fascinating and honestly unexpected path.
Oh, yeah.
So I was looking through one of the journals you sent and came across this article claiming a connection between air pollution and autism. It was published in a well-respected journal, so at first I was pretty intrigued. But as I kept reading, something just felt kind of off. Have you ever felt that with research, where the conclusions seem almost too convenient, like they fit a specific agenda?
Yeah, definitely. I think we've all come across those studies that make you raise an eyebrow.
Right, exactly. Well, that feeling led us to this really thought-provoking article called Open Access, Closed Ethics, How Cures Movements Exploit Science. And it's going to be a wild ride today as we unpack the satire, scientific publishing practices, commercial influence, and the ethics of how autism is often framed. Ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so the author starts off with this brilliant satirical take on that landmark air pollution study I mentioned. We meet Dr. Yakubov, a peer reviewer for the journal who's just moved from Perm, Siberia to Boston. Talk about a culture shock, right?
Yeah, quite a change of scenery.
He's reviewing the study and basically questioning everything about it. The study itself is hilarious, by the way. I was literally laughing out loud. It blames autism on everything, from fine particulate matter to nitrogen oxides. And get this, it even suggests that air pollution could actually reverse climate change.
Wow.
I know, right? And the sources. Wikipedia and Science for Busy Moms.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, the author just perfectly captures the absurdity of it all.
Yeah, it is incredibly funny. But you're right, there's that underlying off feeling. What I found interesting is how this fictional study kind of mirrors the real business interests of the authors of the original air pollution article.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, they're connected to a couple of Israeli biotech companies, Neuronos and Point 6 Bio, and both of them focus on, wait for it, manipulating nitric oxide pathways to treat autism.
So basically, they might have created this study to support their existing ventures.
It's hard to say for sure, but it does make you wonder. It's a little too convenient to be just a coincidence.
Yeah, it really makes you think about all the other research out there and whether financial motives are lurking behind these seemingly groundbreaking discoveries.
Exactly. We're seeing a growing trend of companies using these quasi-scientific studies as marketing tools,
Yeah.
basically leveraging the appearance of academic research to push their agendas. And it's incredibly misleading, especially for readers who might not have the expertise to critically evaluate the findings.
Absolutely. And I have to admit, this article's focus on Israel's role in this type of research made me a bit uncomfortable. This whole idea of curing autism, especially with the article's emphasis on Israel, felt like it was wading into dangerous territory, especially considering the history of eugenics movements.
I see your point. It's a valid concern. Framing autism as something that needs to be cured can be incredibly dehumanizing. It reinforces the idea that neurodiversity is a defect that needs to be eliminated, completely ignoring the lived experiences and perspectives of autistic individuals. It's like saying, you're not okay as you are.
That actually ties into the articles you send us about open access publishing. The author of this piece is very critical of pay-to-publish journals and how they contribute to the problem of questionable research being presented as legitimate. Did you get a sense of that in your research?
Absolutely. One of the biggest critiques of the pay-to-publish model is that it can really lower the bar for research quality. Journals are incentivized to publish as much as possible because it generates revenue. And this can sometimes compromise the rigor of the peer review process. So as a result, studies that might not hold up under scrutiny in more reputable journals can slip through the cracks and gain credibility that they maybe don't deserve.
So it's like a cycle. Questionable research gets published, then used to justify potentially harmful cures, all while profiting off of people's anxieties. It's pretty disheartening, honestly.
It is, and this erosion of trust in scientific publishing has consequences that reach far and wide. When it becomes difficult to distinguish legitimate research from marketing ploys, it undermines our ability to have informed discussions about important topics.
And the article brings up another tactic that's often used in these types of studies, the odds ratio narrative. It plays on people's fears by highlighting the increased risk of autism, framing it as something to be feared rather than a natural part of human diversity. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this odds ratio concept can be incredibly misleading when taken out of context. It really preys on people's anxieties, leading them to make decisions based on fear rather than accurate information. It's like saying your odds of winning the lottery are 1 in 100 million, which is technically true, but ignores the fact that almost nobody wins.
So it's like a marketing tactic masquerading as science.
Exactly. And sadly, it often works. People get scared, they want a solution, and suddenly these companies with their cures appear to have all the answers. It's manipulative and diverts attention and resources away from research that could actually benefit autistic people.
So where do we go from here?
Well, it's definitely disheartening to see how these fear and profit motives can really skew the research landscape. But the article doesn't just leave us hanging in despair. It actually ends with a pretty powerful call to action.
Yeah, that's what gives me hope. But before we get into that, I think it's important to figure out how we as individuals can become more discerning consumers of scientific information, especially in a world where it's increasingly difficult to separate fact from fiction. Any tips for navigating this complex world?
Hmm. It's a challenge for sure. I think a good place to start is by understanding the different types of scientific publications. Remember, not all open access journals are created equal. Just because a journal charges for publication doesn't automatically mean the research is bad. There are reputable open access journals out there that maintain high standards of peer review. The key is to be a savvy reader.
So, how do we tell the good from the bad? Are there any red flags we should watch out for?
Great question. One thing to pay attention to is the funding source. If a study is funded by a company that stands to benefit directly from the results, it's a good idea to approach it with a healthy dose of skepticism. Always look for potential conflicts of interest. Are the authors connected to any organizations that might bias their findings? This info is usually disclosed in the study itself, so make sure to check.
It's like checking the label on a product before you buy it. You want to know what's in it and where it came from.
That's a great analogy. And just like with food labels, you have to learn to read between the lines. Don't just be swayed by flashy headlines or bold claims. Dig deeper into the methodology, the data analysis, and the conclusions drawn. If a study is making sweeping statements based on flimsy evidence or relies heavily on correlation rather than causation, that's a sign to be cautious.
So it's about being an active reader, not just passively absorbing information. We need to engage critically with the material and ask questions.
Exactly. Ask yourself, what's the sample size? Are the methods used in the research sound? Are there any limitations that the researchers acknowledge? Asking these questions can really help you evaluate the study's validity and determine if the conclusions are actually backed up by the data.
And what about those odds ratio narratives we discussed? How can we avoid falling for that kind of manipulation?
It all comes down to context. When you see statistics about increased risk, always stop and think, increased risk compared to what? And what does that risk actually mean practically? A lot of times these studies zero in on relative risk, which could be super misleading. For instance, if something increases your risk of a condition from 0.1% to 0.2%, that's technically a 100% increase in relative risk, but the absolute risk is still very small.
Right. So we need to watch out for studies that prey on our anxieties and offer simple solutions to problems that are actually quite complex, especially when those solutions seem to benefit the researchers themselves. It comes back to trust and transparency.
Absolutely. The cures movement often exploits these fears and profits from the desperation of vulnerable individuals and families. It's crucial to advocate for research that focuses on genuinely improving the lives of autistic people instead of trying to fix or eradicate autism.
And speaking of that, the article ends with a call to action, urging readers to push for stricter oversight in scientific publishing and a shift in research priorities towards actually improving the lives of autistic people. It's a powerful message, for sure. But I think a lot of people feel overwhelmed by the idea of tackling these big issues. Where do we even start?
Yeah, it's true. These are systemic problems that require collective action. But everyone can play a part no matter how small. Supporting organizations that fight for autistic rights, amplifying autistic voices, and educating ourselves and others about neurodiversity are all meaningful things we can do.
So it's about changing the narrative, right? Moving away from this deficit-based view of autism and really embracing the idea of neurodiversity.
You got it. We need to ditch this idea that autism is something that needs fixing. We should be embracing neurodiversity and focusing on research that helps autistic people live fulfilling and meaningful lives.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah.
So instead of desperately searching for a cure, we should be focusing on understanding and supporting the autistic experience.
Exactly. And that understanding needs to come from autistic people themselves. We have to ensure that their voices are represented in research, from the design and implementation to the interpretation of findings. Too often, research about autism is done to autistic people instead of with them.
So it's about shifting those power dynamics. Instead of treating autistic individuals as just subjects in research, we need to start seeing them as active partners and decision makers.
Absolutely. And this change needs to happen beyond the research world, too. We need authentic autistic representation in policy-making advocacy and every area that affects the lives of autistic individuals.
It's about acknowledging the expertise and lived experience of autistic people and valuing what they bring to the table, not just in research, but in all aspects of society.
Exactly. Ultimately, it's about building a society that celebrates neurodiversity and empowers everyone to reach their full potential. We need to shift from asking, how can we fix this, to asking, how can we best support you?
That's a fantastic point. It's such a powerful shift in perspective. But how can we as individuals contribute to that change practically? It can feel overwhelming to think about tackling such large-scale issues.
You're right, it can feel daunting.
Hmm.
But remember, even the smallest actions can have a ripple effect. We can start by supporting organizations that fight for the rights of autistic people, amplify autistic voices, and educate ourselves and others about neurodiversity.
We can also be more mindful in our daily lives, supporting businesses that prioritize inclusivity and accessibility, challenging harmful stereotypes when we encounter them, and speaking up against discrimination.
Exactly. It's about weaving these values into the fabric of our lives and inspiring those around us to do the same.
So it's a combination of personal action and systemic change, working hand in hand to build a more just and equitable world for autistic people. It's not easy, but it's a goal worth striving for.
I couldn't agree more. As we continue to learn and grow, we can make a real difference. This is just the beginning of a much larger conversation, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
Me too. This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening, and I feel a renewed sense of purpose. It's not just about understanding the issues, it's about taking action and making the world a better place for autistic people. It's easy to get bored down, in all the negativity when we talk about these issues. But honestly, I'm feeling kind of hopeful after our conversation. It's empowering to realize that we can actually be part of the solution.
Yeah, I agree. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but change really does start with each of us. And all those little everyday actions, when we all do them together, can add up to make a big difference.
So let's talk about some of those actions. What are some practical steps we can take to be more, discerning when it comes to scientific information? It can feel like navigating a minefield out there.
Oh, it definitely is.
Yeah.
There's just a constant flood of information these days. I think the first and most important thing is to be a critical reader. Don't just take everything at face value, especially those attention-grabbing headlines and dramatic claims. Remember what we talked about. Always check the source. Look for potential bias and pay close attention to the methodology used in the study.
Like being a detective, right? Following the evidence and making sure it all adds up.
Exactly. And if something feels off or too good to be true, don't be afraid to dig a little deeper. Consult multiple sources, cross-reference information, and get perspectives from different experts in the field. It's all about being an informed and empowered reader.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about when we come across those fear-mongering odds ratio narratives? The ones that try to scare us into making certain choices. How can we avoid getting caught up in all the hype?
Context is key. Don't let statistics scare you without understanding what they actually mean in the bigger picture. Ask yourself, what's the baseline risk? What are the potential benefits and harms of any proposed solutions? And I think most importantly, ask yourself, does this information align with the values and priorities of the autistic community? Their voices should be at the center of all these discussions.
That's so important, centering the voices and experiences of autistic people in all of this. Their perspectives are so valuable, and often they're the ones who can best guide us towards solutions that actually work. How can we do a better job of making sure those voices are heard?
There are tons of ways to do that. Start by following autistic creators and advocates on social media. Read books and articles written by autistic authors. Their lived experiences offer incredible insights. And support organizations that are led by and for autistic people. Those organizations are on the front lines, advocating for change and supporting the community.
Right. And when we have these conversations about autism, it's crucial that we listen respectfully and avoid speaking for or over autistic individuals. They deserve to have their voices heard, and we can all help create space for that.
Absolutely. It's about making space for authentic representation and acknowledging the diversity of experiences within the autistic community. Everyone's journey is unique, and we should come to these conversations ready to learn and with a lot of humility.
So we've talked about being informed consumers of information, but what about taking action on a bigger scale? How can we push for systemic change in research and beyond? It can feel like an uphill battle sometimes.
You're right. It's definitely not easy, but it's not impossible either. One of the most important things we can do is support those advocacy organizations that are working so hard to reform scientific publishing, promote ethical research practices, and fight for the rights of autistic people. These organizations need our support, whether it's through donations, volunteering our time, or just spreading awareness about their work.
And we can use our own voices to hold institutions accountable too, right?
Definitely. Write to your elected officials, contact universities and research institutions. Let them know that you expect them to do better and that you're paying attention. Don't underestimate the power of collective action. When we all come together and speak up, we can create real and lasting change.
It's inspiring to think about the impact we can have when we work together. This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening, and I'm leaving with a renewed sense of purpose. It's not just about understanding the issues, it's about taking action and creating a more just and equitable world for autistic people.
Couldn't agree more. This conversation is really just the beginning, and I'm so excited to see what we can all accomplish together to create a more inclusive and understanding world.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even inspiring. And remember, the conversation doesn't stop here. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a better world for everyone.